Thanks for that introduction, Sylvia. So I'm going to give a short talk about transdisciplinary research. I hope it's not old hat to everybody here, and that there might be some useful insights to be had. So, well, what is transdisciplinary research? It's research by many other names. It's called action research, participatory, collaborative, cooperative, citizen or civic science, mode 2, post-normal. Um, it's all of those things, and it goes much further than inter or multidisciplinary research, which is something that I find myself constantly having to explain colleagues and even people in working in the European research policy environment, because it's much more than applying many disciplines to a problem or disciplines speaking to each other, but it's doing all of those things and going beyond to engage so-called non-traditional research actors to solve wicked sustainability problems. And in the European context, transdisciplinary refers most often in terms of non-traditional partners to partners from civil society and from industry. So why is there so much interest in transdisciplinary research? Well, it's considered the sustainability science with great transformative potential. Some people have called it magical, capable of producing all manner of synergies and unexpected results. But at the same time, because there are multiple actors from different institutions, countries, and regions, it means that there are often tensions and even political dynamics, which is surprising for some because these are supposed to be egalitarian spaces of mutual learning. And so the different factors that come into play, for example, are anything from personal and organizational motives to different organizational or institutional priorities, different styles of communication, different organizational cultures, different ways of working. And so integration is really a huge challenge in doing transdisciplinary research. But at the same time, the funding mechanisms itself can drive and exacerbate these challenges. So in the European context, again, because that's the one that I'm most familiar with, it's quite obvious that funding conditions and criteria haven't really yet caught up with the very demanding needs of transdisciplinary research. So there are certain criteria for building your consortia, and these are quite suboptimal. Some calls, especially recent Horizon 2020 and the 7th framework before that, call for ever larger sizes of consortia, geographic spreads, certain compositions. Some funding calls require that you have a partner from industry in there, which is problematic, especially if you're working with radical grassroots organizations and civil society organizations. The potential for co-optation is tremendous. But also, these criteria have implications for the amount of resources that you need to manage these consortia. And generally, there are guidelines for sort of how much of your budget can be used for management and communication. And it is generally never enough for the amount of work it takes to keep information flowing and creativity happening. Also, researchers are usually in the driver's seat. They apply for the funds as sort of leaders. They're in control of projects, and unfortunately, and I think Leda will probably speak to this a little bit later, researchers, despite their best intentions, tend to take really instrumental approaches to engaging with CSOs. There's a lot of sort of tacking them on CSOs as sort of dissemination vehicles, or this sort of handbook mentality where you see projects as part of their deliverables, a handbook on how to teach activists to do research. But there are also usually really weak connections with policy issues and policy processes, something that I've called here briefing note syndrome. Everybody pledges to produce a bunch of briefing notes that end up getting emailed to people that don't read them, don't use them, or sitting on a website. And maybe that's something Celine might also be able to speak to. And Leda as well. I know Leda has a lot of expertise in engaging with the policy realm. Then there's the issue of time and resources for defining objectives, what we, well, I guess researchers and policymakers like to talk about in terms of upstream engagement. So major EU funding programs don't usually have sort of a seed funding stage where partners have the resources to actually get together and hash out what they want to do together and how it can be mutually beneficial. And then there are the administrative burdens, which are tremendous in terms of reporting and accounting. And these are quite onerous, especially for smaller organizations, and not just CSOs, but smaller research institutes as well. So larger, well-funded institutes with really well-equipped research departments tend to be the dominant kind of research partner in these programs. And all of these factors together can lead to unexpected dilemmas, even for seasoned so-called pracademics. And I don't know if you have a hand-raising function here, but I imagine probably some of us in the room are pracademics to an extent, maybe all of us. So I thought to illustrate, I would come up with 3 little vignettes from different projects that I looked at in my doctoral research to sort of show what can happen. The first case study was from a project that was called CRAPE that ran quite early on, I think 2008 to 2010. And this was a really groundbreaking project because this was a new scheme that was just for CSOs to lead research. And I really wish that they had kept it, but they didn't. They did away with this. It wasn't popular enough. But anyway, so this was a major project on agrofuels, and this particular work package was focused on assessing the impacts of biofuels in Europe and the global south. So just by way for a bit of context, this was a project led by a hybrid organization, so totally pracademic. These were, I think this organization was actually categorized as a CSO in EU terms, but really they were a research CSO. They were experts in land grabbing, but just after the proposal was accepted, their biofuels person left. So there was actually, by the time the funding came through, nobody in the organization who knew anything about biofuels. Their land grabbing was their thing. So, I mean, they had a really competent person leading the work. She was constantly in catch-up mode, but they did the things. They had a really strong network, really great grassroots ties, and they were able to draw on a lot of expertise through cooperation to produce this study that they were supposed to produce on the impacts of biofuels. But a key moment came when the sort of central activity of this work package, which was a collaborative workshop, was organized in Maputo, Mozambique. And the staff sort of did their thing. They did their presentation, they presented their research, and then there was rebellion. So all of these amazing activists had come from all over Africa and Brazil, and they just said, this is not working for us. This is your methodology is too academic. We need to change this or we're going to disengage. And so they did. This small team sort of, well, you can see the quote, they stopped, they reorganized, they handed over power, and it just transformed the entire event. And the outcomes were really positive. So in my research, when I spoke to some of the grassroots organizations who were there, several of them said, we went away with the strong testimonial evidence. We used this in our own campaigns. And then the collaboration continued between this project partner and networks were ultimately strengthened. Other projects came out of this project and it was a great thing. The second case study was from a project called GAP2. This was about making fisheries more sustainable. And in fact, this project GAP2 had a predecessor project where essentially everybody was able to negotiate their aims and outcomes and build solid partnerships. And it kind of filled the gap that seed funding normally should provide. So there was a solid partnership. There was a fisheries scientist and a coordinator of a local fisheries association. They were ready for the second phase to go to develop indicators based on fishermen's lay knowledge to assess the size of fish stocks. But then something happened. As they were moving forward, both the fisherman partner and the scientist decided if the research we produce is going to be used, we need to bring in another partner. And so they went to the most influential fisheries research institute in Norway to collaborate. And this institute joined, but they actually weren't interested in lay knowledge. And so they came up with another solution that involved like echo sounding rather. It was a completely technological solution. So the Fishermen's Association was completely sidelined. There was actually no actionable research, and the scientists couldn't get further funding because nobody in the fisheries policy, area was actually interested. And they explained this is because the stocks are actually well managed. Fisheries aren't in crisis, or weren't at that time, in Norway. And so the whole sort of push for transdisciplinary research just seemed really irrelevant in that policy context. And this was a European-wide project, so there were other fisheries from other countries in Europe involved. But what the scientist in charge said in the end, that, it was in a way a spectacular failure, but in a way it was also a success, because the entire project was about understanding the obstacles to cooperative research, and that knowledge was certainly generated by this project, in terms of, I suppose, again, being aware of the policy context and making sure that projects, when they are planned with that policy connection in mind. And then the third case came from the EJOLT project, a project that Leda and I actually both worked on together. So Leda, you might have additional insights or even contrasting ones. The part of this project that I chose to focus on was work around the concept of ecological debt. So our project had activists and academics from like 20 countries in the north and in the south working together to produce these particular deliverables, one of which was a book on ecological debt. And another aspect of the work was to propose policy recommendations at different levels. So a key moment, or several key moments, I think, arose in our project where there was some pretty serious disagreement between activists from the South, some particularly radical, you could even say militant activists, who disagreed with some of our academics' approach to addressing, explaining, building awareness about ecological debt. They really took issue with the academics' plans to try and quantify ecological debt, and they disagreed with the legal partners' assessment of the potential for operationalizing ecological debt under international law. The lawyers were quite skeptical. And so they refused, these Southern activists refused to sign off on some deliverables. The way this was resolved was through quite a lot of mediation, and in the end, all the viewpoints were integrated into the reports and publications, and some extra publications were added. And at the end of the project, relations were positive, networks were actually strengthened, and academics' views and practices were actually transformed. And so I include a couple of quotes here as evidence from one of our academic partners, the lawyer. When I interviewed him, he said, "We learned that our modus operandi had to change. Being more cooperative, gaining more feedback from partners, our participation not only was extremely enriched, but the entire research agenda of their organization," he said, "was refocused." And then from our activist, I asked her what she thought of everything and how it went. And she said it was a good space, even with the polemics. We had the possibility to participate in international meetings and to strategize. It was a good process that strengthened our relations, and it's part of a movement building process. So it wasn't always comfortable, and it certainly wasn't easy. But at the end of the project, I think everybody agreed it had been fruitful. So the takeaways: transdisciplinary research is really learning by doing. You start off with the best intent, hoping to, I guess, have as smooth a project as possible, but that's never going to happen. There are some identifiable keys to success that I was able to sort of draw out from looking at the 3 projects I looked at in my research. One was that full, meaningful engagement of all partners, especially CSO partners, from the inception phase to dissemination is essential. Trust and flexibility. Projects really benefit from having resources and opportunities built in for joint reflection and problem solving. Partners often said to me that they value the processes almost as, well, definitely as much or more than the outputs, the so-called deliverables. And it was always good to have some pracademics around, especially in leadership positions, who could anticipate these kinds of issues. And the benefits almost always, most of the time actually, outweigh the risks. So partners report significant capacity and skills benefits, personal and organizational transformation, being able to produce research that is socially relevant and actually has a visible impact, expanded networks, enduring relationships, further collaboration, and mutual learning, even when projects, quote unquote, fail. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. And I think also, if people in our audience are interested in understanding what projects are out there, how they work, there's always the Cordis website where you can look up previous projects in areas that you're interested in to see what's been done before and what there is to build on, because that's always a really positive element of any kind of EU collaboration, when you can demonstrate that you're building on the findings, the results of previous projects. And Sylvia, I don't know if you wanted me to mention something about this upcoming second session now or later.
No. We will do that later.
Okay.
Later.
Okay.
Thank you very much,
okay,
Hali.